Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. There's a civil war in Iraq. What you're seeing now is the collapse of peace in Iraq after these years of the Maliki government has failed to secure the peace won by the American military under George W. Bush. The crisis now for the President of the United States is how to protect American personnel. 5,500 people work at the American Embassy in Baghdad, and then there are consulates throughout the country. There are also lots of contractors there. So the decision tonight is to send in additional security, additional U.S. combat troops, probably Marines, off of the flotilla that's gathering in the Persian Gulf in the event it gets much worse. The insurgents, the ISIS, are reported at Samarra and as close as Tel Afar. The Baghdad airport is to the south of the city. What you're seeing now are battle lines being drawn. That is the civil war in Iraq. I turn, however, to my guest and colleague, David Drucker of the Washington Examiner. David, a very good evening to you. There is turmoil in Washington as well. You cover it closely at the Washington Examiner. There's a leadership contest coming up for the Republicans this week, I believe.
That's correct. On Thursday, House Republicans will meet behind closed doors, probably in the basement of the U.S. Capitol, and they'll choose a new majority leader to replace Eric Cantor, who, of course, is going to step down July 31st because he lost his primary for his reelection. And you're also most likely going to have a race for majority whip, who's supposed to be the vote enforcer. It doesn't quite work that way anymore for several reasons, but the contest for whip is actually the contest because Kevin McCarthy, who's the current whip, will beat Representative Raul Labrador of Idaho for majority leader. What we don't know yet is whether the whip will be Steve Scalise, Peter Roskam, or, is it possible that a dark horse candidate like Marlin Stutzman from Indiana could surprise everybody, make it into a second ballot, and come out on top? I give the odds to Scalise at this point, but this is a contest worth watching.
And that's Thursday, and we'll have the results that night.
Correct. It is going to be a secret ballot election, so no matter who tells you they voted for whom, all you can really be sure of is if they say, I didn't vote for that guy, they didn't vote for that guy, and if they were a declared whip for one of the candidates, they almost most likely voted for their guy. But yeah, by Thursday, the dust will settle and Republicans can begin moving forward again, at least we think.
Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, joins me. Thaddeus was a member of the leadership team of the Republican House until recently. Thaddeus, I have not spoken with you since Mr. Cantor's surprise defeat. Did that take you by surprise? The criticism of Mr. Cantor is that all politics are local, and he seems to have run for his primary contest by just sort of mailing it in from Washington. Was he always that way, Thaddeus? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. I was surprised by the defeat, but I think it's wrong to simply blame Eric for not tending the home fires. It's a divide in the Republican Party. You have the rise of the super PACs. You have Tea Party candidates. You had Eric as a member of leadership, but even though he's very conservative, people portrayed him as not conservative enough, and a lot of outside groups and outside interests participated in this election and helped to defeat Eric. So it's not like the old days where you take care of your home base and do your job in Washington. You can upset one guy with a lot of money, and the next thing you know, you get TV ads against you in your district.
Francis Rose of Federal News Radio joins us because there's so many stories we can only click them off here. We have to go very quickly. Francis, a very good evening to you. The Veterans Administration, it started several weeks ago, and there was an unhappy press conference by the president one Friday afternoon. Every Friday afternoon, the president has unhappy things to say these days. And that turned to the idea of how big is the problem and how vast. You have information that there have been people at the VA who have been trying to report problems for years. What is their fate, do we know, Francis? Good evening to you.
Well, good evening, John and David and Thaddeus. Their fate, apparently, is mostly demotion, punishment, and a phenomenon that's known inside the federal government as turkey farming. And that's a phenomenon whereby we decide that, John, we don't like the job that you're doing, so we're going to demote you to another job and essentially give you nothing to do with the hope that you will become so dissatisfied with your job that you'll quit and leave the federal government and we don't have to fire you. That happens commonly at the Department of Veterans Affairs. A colleague of mine has reported on that on federalnewsradio.com. On a number of occasions. And it's not limited just to the Department of Veterans Affairs, but of course what's going on there is getting a lot of attention now, because it fits the narrative of what's going on inside VA because of this healthcare scandal.
David, comment here. The VA, it's very difficult to get back to it now because we have the civil war in Iraq and we have other crises, international crises, Ukraine not the least of it, and now we have this momentary excitement over the IRS. But to your knowledge, is the VA the one that worries people the most because of the scale of it?
I think so, and because everybody appreciates and loves military veterans. It's the only thing on Capitol Hill that ever seems to cut through the partisanship, and that even includes Republicans giving more money to the VA. It includes Democrats trying to make it easier for VA executives to be fired, not as much as Republicans would like, but still the point is it's something that really pushes voters' buttons, and there is so much more here. You know, the VA, if we forget, was pushed off the front page by Bergdahl, which was pushed off the front page by Cantor, and so on. But the investigation continues. The chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee has hired more investigators, and he said that it's only going to get worse, and that what's going to come out is that the VA has been systematically lying to Congress, and I think that it's going to provide a lot of news throughout the summer.
Thaddeus, comment on the VA scandal, because it's difficult to see from this remove. Have you seen it covered heavily in Detroit, or has it fallen off the front page there?
No, it's being very heavily covered, as David and Francis have pointed out. There's Americans respect our vets and know that we can't do enough for them. And to take that, and in the old times it was, we're not doing enough for our veterans. Now it's, my God, what have they done to our veterans? And so the public is very focused on this.
Because there's serial investigations ongoing, and you mentioned, I momentarily forgot, I blanked on Bergdahl. I just blanked on it. They started that investigation today. Francis, I know that you do in-depth with Francis Rose in the afternoon. Did you have time for Bergdahl today? I understand the Army opened an investigation of the circumstances of him going AWOL or whatever he did.
Yeah, with the focus, the laser focus that I have on what's going on inside the executive branch, the Bergdahl story is not the kind of thing that is really my story. But I did want to follow up on the checklist that David gave about this legislation. The piece of it that strikes me that he didn't mention about these bipartisan bills is the willingness with which Democrats conceded that these veterans should be able to essentially get vouchers to go outside the VA system and go get care from private health care providers. That, I think, is the element that has shocked me and a lot of people, the willingness that they gave in on that issue.
David, do you want to comment on that? Because I heard that early on, vouchers, and then it disappeared for a while. Is that a revolution there?
That is very interesting, and I'm glad Francis brought it up, because it's actually the most telling example of how this issue has brought both sides together in an attempt to solve things. Now, clearly, Republicans have a little bit of a harder rhetorical edge because they're also going after the administration. But if you listen to Bernie Sanders, who's essentially a very, very left-of-center Democrat to the point where he's an independent and goes by that moniker, even he has agreed that whatever it takes to get these veterans care, and that is probably, I think Francis is right, the most significant tell as to how this thing is playing on the Hill.
Gentlemen, there's so much right now. I want to give each of you a chance to explain to the public whether this is unusual or whether we're just going to have to get used to it with, 5 months to go to the election? I'll start with you, Thaddeus. David ticked off what we have are headlines, but I add to this, Ukraine is not solved. We have conflict in the East China Sea and the South China Sea that could easily dissolve into shooting war. That's how close it comes out there. The Vietnamese are ramming Chinese boats, and the Chinese are doing very close flybys to Japanese surveillance aircraft. So do you believe this turmoil is normative all the way to the election? Just 15 seconds. Go ahead, Thaddeus.
No, it's a continuing decline. It's a continuing decline of confidence because the public knows they're being messaged, not governed, and they're getting narrative, not truth, and events will continue to escalate.
Francis, is this normal for you? Are you exhausted at Federal News Radio?
I'm not exhausted, but I think it's going to get sillier as more Democrats abandon the president during election season.
David, I'm very glad you're here with me in studio, but geez, David, is Washington crazy?
I came here to get a break. This is a very tumultuous time. It's historically not necessarily the norm, but I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon.
David Drucker, Washington Examiner, Francis Rose, Federal News Radio, Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes. I'm John Batchelor.